What if everything you think started with the internet actually began decades earlier on a machine most people have never heard of? A machine where teenagers sent each other digital notes in class, where people stayed up all night exploring virtual worlds, where hackers were born and friendships blossomed through glowing text on a screen. It existed. America created it, and then let it fade into the shadows of history. In the heart of Illinois, on the sprawling campus of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, something extraordinary was taking shape in the early 1960s. While most Americans were watching black and white television sets and rotary phones were still the height of communication technology, a small team of engineers and educators were building something that would quietly predict the future. They called it PLATO, the programmed logic for automatic teaching operations. The name sounds technical and cold, doesn't it? But what it became was anything but cold. It became warm, human, alive with possibility. Picture this: a computer terminal with a glowing orange plasma screen, one of the first flat panel displays ever created. The glow was distinct, almost haunting in the dim computer labs. You'd sit in front of it, usually in a basement or a quiet corner of a university building, and suddenly you weren't alone anymore. You were connected to hundreds, then thousands of other people, all typing, all thinking, all sharing the same digital space. This wasn't some clunky calculator or data processor. This was the first real social network. This was community in a box, decades before anyone used that word to describe what happened online. The year was 1960 when Donald Bitzer and his team first fired up the earliest version of PLATO at the university's Coordinated Science Laboratory. The original goal was simple enough: create a teaching machine that could help students learn more efficiently. But something unexpected happened, the way it always does when you give creative people access to new tools. By the early 1970s, PLATO had evolved into something nobody had quite anticipated. Users were logging in from terminals scattered across the country. They were sending each other private messages in real time, something called Talkomatic, the world's first true instant messaging system. Can you imagine what that must have felt like in 1973? To type a sentence and have someone miles away respond immediately, not through a phone call, not through a letter, but through silent, glowing text on a screen. People were creating chat rooms before that term even existed. They were building online communities around shared interests. There were forums for science fiction fans, for musicians, for people who just wanted to talk about their day. Strangers were becoming friends without ever seeing each other's faces. The system had features that seem almost prophetic now. Personal notes, a messaging system that worked like email but was actually faster and more intuitive. Term talk, which let multiple people have conversations simultaneously in separate channels. There was even a system for creating and sharing lesson plans, educational content, and tutorials that looked remarkably like the collaborative platforms we use today. Teachers were using PLATO in ways nobody had imagined. Students in rural Illinois could take advanced chemistry courses taught by professors hundreds of miles away. The computer would grade their work instantly, provide feedback, adjust difficulty based on their progress. This was adaptive learning before anyone called it that. But it was the unplanned features, the ones users created themselves, that truly transformed PLATO into something magical. Someone figured out how to make emoticons on the system, little faces made of punctuation marks that conveyed emotion through text. Sound familiar? That was 1972. The creativity of PLATO users knew no bounds. They built their own programming languages within the system. They created educational simulations that brought chemistry labs and physics experiments to life on those orange screens. Medical students were practicing diagnoses on virtual patients. Engineering students were designing structures and testing them in simulated environments. None of this was supposed to happen, but it did because the people using PLATO refused to see it as just a teaching tool. And the games. Oh, the games. This is where it gets really remarkable. Programmers on PLATO created some of the first multiplayer online games in history. Games like Empire, where up to 32 players could battle for galactic domination simultaneously. Games like Airfight, a flight simulator where you could dogfight against other real players in real time. These weren't simple text adventures. These were complex, engaging, addictive experiences that looked and felt like the future. There was Avatar, a dungeon crawler that would inspire an entire generation of role-playing games. There was Moria and Oubliette, games that directly influenced what would later become the gaming industry giants we know today. Kids were staying up until dawn, logging in from university terminals, exploring digital dungeons with friends they'd never met in person. The games had depth that seems impossible for their era. Players formed guilds and alliances. They developed strategies and shared secrets. They created maps of virtual worlds on graph paper, passing them around like treasure maps. Some players became legends, their usernames spoken with reverence in computer labs across the country. The PLATO community developed its own culture, its own language, its own set of unwritten rules and social dynamics. There were PLATO romances, real relationships that began with typed conversations on those orange screens. People fell in love through words alone, through late-night chats about philosophy or science or just life. Some of those relationships led to marriages. Some of those marriages are still going today. There were PLATO celebrities, too, users who became known throughout the system for their programming skills, their wit, their kindness, or their gaming prowess. You could build a reputation there, become someone, be recognized and respected by a community that spanned states and eventually countries. Your username became your identity in a way that feels completely normal now, but was absolutely revolutionary then. The sense of belonging was powerful. People who felt isolated in their physical lives, whether because of geography or circumstances or just personality, found acceptance on PLATO. The shy kid who couldn't make friends at school became a dungeon master leading epic quests. The small-town teenager interested in computers found mentors and colleagues who understood their passion. The adult learner trying to change careers found support and resources they couldn't access anywhere else. People formed genuine bonds through PLATO that transcended the limitations of the technology. They would arrange to meet in person at conferences or gatherings, finally putting faces to the usernames they'd known for years. These meetings were often emotional, bringing together people who had shared so much of their lives through glowing text, but had never shaken hands or heard each other's voices. There were PLATO artists who created intricate graphics using the system's surprisingly advanced visual capabilities. Remember, this was the 1970s. Most computer displays showed nothing but text. But PLATO had graphics, animation, even primitive touchscreens. Artists were making digital art decades before Photoshop existed. The artwork created on PLATO ranged from simple geometric patterns to complex illustrations that pushed the system to its limits. Some users created animated sequences, frame by frame, that played back like tiny films. Others designed user interfaces and visual elements for the games and educational programs. The constraint of working with limited colors and resolution only seemed to fuel their creativity. There were PLATO musicians who figured out how to make the terminals produce sound, composing electronic music on a machine that wasn't designed for it. The resourcefulness was breathtaking. Every limitation became a challenge to overcome. Every technical boundary became something to push against. Musicians composed original pieces using the terminal's audio capabilities, creating chiptune-style music before that genre had a name. Some wrote programs that turned PLATO into a primitive synthesizer. Others collaborated across terminals, creating ensemble pieces where timing and coordination happened through the network itself. The system kept growing. By the late 1970s, Plato had thousands of users logging in daily from terminals across the United States and eventually around the world. Control Data Corporation, a major computer company, had licensed the technology and was trying to commercialize it, installing Plato terminals in schools, libraries, and businesses. At its peak, Plato connected users from dozens of institutions: University of Delaware, Florida State, Princeton, Stanford, even international locations in Europe and Asia. The network was truly global before most people understood what a global computer network could mean. Students in Tokyo could collaborate with students in Illinois on the same project in real time, something that seemed like science fiction to anyone outside the Plato community. For people who used Plato regularly, it became a second home, a place where you could be yourself or be someone else entirely, where your ideas mattered more than your appearance, where geography didn't limit friendship, where learning and playing and socializing all blended together into something entirely new. Some universities built entire computer labs around Plato terminals. Students would line up waiting for their turn, their chance to log in and see what messages waited, what games were active, who else was online. The orange glow of those screens became a beacon, a signal that something different was happening in that room. Walking into a Plato lab in the late 70s was like stepping into another world. Rows of terminals, each with that distinctive orange glow, each occupied by someone lost in concentration, the soft clicking of keys, the occasional laugh or groan as someone won or lost a game. The sense of collective focus, everyone engaged in their own digital adventure, but somehow part of the same larger experience. Regular users developed rituals around their Plato time, checking messages first thing, seeing who was online, logging into favorite games or discussion groups. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern that felt comforting and exciting at the same time. You never quite knew what would happen when you logged in, who you might talk to, what new program someone might have created overnight. The technology was expensive. Each terminal cost thousands of dollars, and the mainframe computers required to run the system were massive, room-filling machines that needed constant maintenance and expert operators. For all its innovation, Plato was still tied to the old model of centralized computing, where power and data lived in one place and users connected to it through dedicated terminals. The economics were brutal. Running a Plato system meant maintaining expensive hardware, paying for dedicated phone lines, employing technical staff around the clock. Educational institutions struggled to justify the costs, even as students and teachers raved about what the system could do. Budget committees didn't understand why you needed this expensive computer network when textbooks and blackboards had worked for generations. Meanwhile, something else was happening. A different kind of network was being developed, something funded by the Department of Defense, called ARPANET. It was less flashy, more focused on military and academic research communication. But it had something Plato didn't have. It was built on a decentralized model, where no single computer controlled everything. It was adaptable, expandable, and it used protocols that could work on any kind of computer. ARPANET represented a fundamentally different philosophy. Where Plato was a walled garden, beautiful but isolated, ARPANET was designed to be open and interconnected. The protocols it used, which would eventually become the foundation of the Internet, were intentionally designed to work across different types of computers and networks. It wasn't as advanced or user-friendly as Plato, but it had something more important in the long run. It had flexibility. And then personal computers started arriving. The Apple II in 1977, the IBM PC in 1981, the Commodore 64 in 1982. Suddenly, people could have computing power in their homes, on their desks. The idea of going to a special terminal in a university basement started to feel archaic, even if what you could do there was still more advanced than what those early home computers offered. The personal computer revolution changed everything. Kids who once begged their parents to drive them to the university so they could use Plato now had computers in their bedrooms, The machines were less powerful, the software less sophisticated, but they were yours. You could use them whenever you wanted, for however long you wanted. That freedom was intoxicating. Control Data Corporation, which had bet heavily on Plato, started facing financial troubles. The educational market they'd hoped to capture never materialized the way they'd imagined. Schools were buying personal computers instead of expensive Plato terminals. The business model was crumbling. CDC tried to pivot, offering Plato on different platforms, trying to make it work on personal computers and through dial-up connections. But the magic was in the integrated system, the powerful terminals, the instant responsiveness, the shared mainframe bringing everyone together. Stripped-down versions running on home computers felt like pale imitations of the real thing. Through the 1980s, Plato kept running, kept evolving. But the momentum was fading. The community remained dedicated, even passionate. But new users weren't flooding in the way they had before. The world was moving in a different direction, toward distributed networks and personal computing. The loyal users watched as their digital world slowly contracted. Terminals were decommissioned, sites were disconnected. The population dwindled. What had once been a thriving metropolis of thousands became a small town of hundreds, then dozens. But those who remained were fiercely devoted, holding on to something they knew was special even as the world moved past it. There was a melancholy to those final years. Long-time users logged in and found fewer familiar names. Favorite games sat empty, waiting for players who no longer came. Discussion forums that once buzzed with activity grew quiet. It was like watching a beloved neighborhood slowly empty out as people moved away, one by one. The University of Illinois eventually sold the Plato system and its associated trademarks. It changed hands several times. Different companies tried to find new life for the technology, new markets, new applications. But the magic was fading. The moment had passed. By 2006, the last major Plato system was shut down. The orange screens went dark. The communities that had flourished for decades dispersed to other platforms, to the Internet that had grown up alongside, and eventually surpassed their pioneering digital home. And here's what breaks your heart if you stop and think about it. Everything we do online today, every social media platform, every instant message, every multiplayer game, every online community, every digital friendship, Plato did it first. Not as a prototype, not as an experiment, as a living, breathing, thriving reality that thousands of people were part of for decades. The people who built the Internet, who created the services we use every day, many of them had used Plato. They knew what was possible because they'd lived it. They'd experienced real-time communication, online communities, multiplayer gaming, all of it. Plato was the proof of concept, the demonstration that this kind of digital social life could exist and thrive. Some of the most influential figures in computing history spent time on Plato. Game designers who would go on to create industry-defining titles. Software engineers who would build the infrastructure of the modern Internet. Educators who would revolutionize online learning. They all drew from their Plato experiences, consciously or unconsciously shaping the digital world based on lessons learned on those orange screens. But because it was tied to expensive proprietary hardware, because it existed in the shadow of academic and corporate computing, because it never quite broke through to mainstream awareness, Plato became a footnote, a piece of history that most people who benefit from what it pioneered have never heard of. The Plato users who lived through those years, who spent their youth or their college days or their careers logging into those glowing orange screens, they remember. They remember the friendships, the adventures, the late nights, the sense of being part of something unprecedented. Some of them have worked to preserve that history, to document the games and systems and culture of Plato before it's lost completely. There are Plato emulators now, ways to experience something like what it was. There are archives of the software, reconstructions of the games. dedicated historians and former users keeping the memory alive. But it's not the same. It can't be. The community was the heart of Plato, and communities exist in their moment. You can preserve the technology, but you can't quite bottle the feeling of being there when something brand new was unfolding. You can log into a Plato emulator today and play Empire or explore the recreated message boards. The interface looks right, the orange glow is there, even some of the old programs run. But you can't recreate the thrill of discovery, the sense that you were experiencing something nobody had experienced before. You can't bring back the community, the people who made Plato alive. America built a machine that predicted the internet, that showed what online life could be, that proved human beings would embrace digital connection if given the chance. And then, not through malice but through the simple economics of technological change, let it slip away. Every like, every message, every game you play online, someone imagined it first in a basement computer lab in the 1960s. Plato didn't fail. It succeeded so completely that we rebuilt it without realizing we were following a blueprint that already existed. The future is rarely invented. It's usually remembered. If you learned something new today, let us know in the comments, and see you next time.